Hey there, it's me Eden. If you are new to the channel, then please subscribe to my channel and visit my Patreon page for early access, link in the description. He's not coping very well. I'm sure he's still on the drink. I spotted several empty bottles in the bin, and the house, it's not being cleaned very well. She paused, listening. Yes, I know it's early, dear, but we have to think of Melissa in all this, she continued, a touch of frustration in her voice. Silence followed as she listened again. Yes, I know being a farmer takes up a lot of time, but all the more reason why he needs some help. Another pause. I know it's a risk if we get social work involved, and losing the kid would probably push him over the edge, but I can't think of anything else we can do. Her voice lowered, almost as if she didn't want to admit it. Yeah, okay, we'll talk more tonight. Mum put the phone down, the weight of the conversation clearly on her mind. She had just returned from visiting my half-cousin George in Ayrshire. George was 32 and owned a large farm near Irvine. He had a daughter, Melissa, who had just turned 2. When Melissa was born, there were complications, and tragically, due to an undetected heart defect in his wife, Grace, she suffered a major heart attack just after Melissa's birth. The medical team did all they could. They revived her once, only for her to suffer a further attack, and she died. Since then, several family members had helped George cope with the loss. At times, he seemed to be on the mend, but then, depression would hit hard, and he'd slip backward again. I liked George. He was a big, strong-looking guy. I had only met him a few times at family gatherings, mostly happier occasions than the last time I saw him. We bonded over football, talking for hours about games and players, old and new. Later that night, when Dad returned from work, I overheard them discussing George again. I thought I heard my name mentioned, maybe not. There was a bit of arguing. Dad was certainly dead set against involving social services, determined that the family could deal with it. He was convinced that Melissa would be taken from George if they got involved, and I had to agree, losing Melissa would be the last straw for him. The next morning, I was sitting at the breakfast table when Mum and Dad came downstairs. Alex, can we talk to you for a minute? They asked, hesitantly. Yeah. Shoot, I replied, a little surprised. Well, you know how George is having some problems again. We were wondering if you could go and stay with him for a while, and help look after Melissa? I stared, stunned. I'm not much good with babies, I said, taken aback. Nonsense. Mum countered. Look how you helped Ashley when she had Megan. And you're going to be a primary teacher, so you know how to deal with kids. Ashley, my sister, had gotten pregnant after a one-night stand, and I had helped care for Megan while she worked. And yes, Mum was right. I had just turned 22 and had qualified as a primary teacher. How long would I need to stay? I asked. Not long, Dad interjected. Just until George gets back on his feet, maybe 10 weeks, tops. You don't start your job at Northgate Primary until mid-August. Dad added, besides, you two get on well, always chatting about football. Maybe that's exactly what George needs right now, a friend around. I felt cornered, defeated. Oh, I suppose, okay, I'll do it. Thanks, Alex. The family needs to stick together during times like this, Mum said, relief in her voice. So, by Saturday morning, I was packed and ready. A large case was loaded into my dad's car, and all three of us drove down to Irvine. George was out in the fields when we arrived, and Mrs. Kane, an elderly lady from the village, was looking after Melissa. She greeted us as I lugged my case inside. On her instructions, I took it upstairs to the room that had been set aside for me. I looked out the window, rolling fields, plowed earth, and pasture stretched out as far as I could see. About 1,000 yards down the driveway was the main barn, a garage for farm vehicles, a silo, and sheep pens. This was my first time visiting the farm. The farmhouse itself had an old-world charm, low ceilings with wooden beams. The only modern changes seemed to be a new bathroom, a conservatory off the kitchen, and central heating. There was only one remaining log fire in the living room, surrounded by a beautiful stone hearth. Mrs. Kane made us coffee in the kitchen and gave us the latest on how George had been since Mum's last visit. He's been, not bad. Had a bit of a blowout last night, went down to the local, came home early this morning. A bit worse for wear, but not as bad as I've seen him. I'm just glad someone's going to stay with him. I'm a bit too old for all this now. She sighed, then added, if you need any help, Alex, just give me a call. The number's on the pad. Mrs. Kane stayed for about an hour before my dad offered to drive her home. Meanwhile, Mum and I attended to Melissa. Mum eventually left me alone with her while she prepared dinner for George's return. Around 6 p.m., we heard a Jeep pull up outside. George got out and walked to the door, taking off his Wellington boots as he entered the house. Margaret, William, Alex, good to see you all, he greeted us warmly. I helped Mum set the table while George and Dad stepped into the conservatory for a cigarette. Mum was making the final preparations for dinner, so I quickly checked on Melissa upstairs. She was still asleep after her afternoon nap. Over dinner, we made small talk, but eventually, George brought up the elephant in the room. So, are you really okay with coming here to look after Melissa, Alex? He asked. I hesitated for a moment. It's fine by me. I don't start my job until late August, and the experience with a child will do me good. You don't mind leaving your friends for a few months to stay here? He pressed. No, it's fine, I reassured him. A few of them have taken summer jobs, and some others are on a hiking holiday in Wales. I'd have been on my own most days anyway. Well, all right then, he said, sounding somewhat relieved. I just didn't want to put you out. Don't worry about it, George. We're family, and we're here to help, Mum chimed in as she cleared the plates. After dinner, George and I chatted about football and life in general. But just before 10 p.m., he announced that he needed to check on the barns. So, he left, and I went upstairs to check on Melissa. She was still asleep, with only the occasional twitch as she moved deeper into her dreams. I tidied up the room a little and then returned to my room to unpack the rest of my things. I had brought a few books with me for the quieter moments, so I flopped onto the bed and started reading a Richard Lehman novel. About 15 minutes later, I heard soft sobs coming from Melissa's room. I put my book down and rushed to her bedside. Shh! Honey, I'm here, I whispered as I picked her up, her tiny arms wrapping around my neck. She kept calling for her mom and dad. Daddy will be home soon, darling, I reassured her. Her sobs eventually faded, and she slipped back into sleep. I gently laid her back down, left her door slightly ajar, and headed downstairs. It was just after 11:15 p.m. when I made myself a cup of coffee. Where is he? I muttered to myself, glancing out the window and down the farm track. I must have dozed off because I woke up with a start when the door banged open. George stumbled in, clearly drunk. You should be gone to bed, he slurred, staggering toward the drinks cabinet. No more, I said firmly, intercepting him before he reached for another drink. You've had enough. How's Alyssa? He mumbled, barely coherent. She's fine, fast asleep, I replied. Now let's get you to bed. I put his arm around my waist and helped him upstairs. Once inside his room, I let him fall onto the bed and pulled off his boots. After dropping a blanket over him, I whispered, "Sleep well," as the first snores escaped from his lips. I gently closed the door behind me. I peeked in on Melissa, noticing an extra single bed in the corner of her room. I figured it might be a good idea to stay close to her, so I kicked off my shoes, pulled off my shirt, and lay down. Soon, like everyone else, I was fast asleep. I was woken early the next morning by a loud knocking at the front door. I hurriedly pulled on my shirt, buttoning it up as I rushed downstairs. Opening the door, I found a man, probably in his late 20s, standing there. "George sleepin' again?" he asked, with a knowing smile. What time is it?" I replied, groggy. "Just after 7. He said he'd meet me in the fields over by Baker's Wood," he explained. "Okay, look, I'll go wake him." "He'll meet you there," I assured him. "Yeah, fine," the man said, shaking his head slightly. "Heavy night again, huh?" I wanted to defend George. "No, he's just tired." With all that's happened, I replied, feeling a knot in my stomach. "All right then, I'm on my way," he said, giving a nod as I closed the door and hurried upstairs. "George, wake up," I called, shaking him gently. "You need to be at work." He groaned and mumbled something incoherent as I shook him harder. Finally, he began to stir. "There was a guy at the door, looking for you." "Something about Baker's Wood," I told him. "Oh, that's Pete," George grunted, rubbing his eyes. "Yeah, I was supposed to meet him. What time is it?" "Just after 7:15, I said. All right. I'll get washed and head out," he muttered, rolling out of bed. "You want any breakfast?" I offered, trying to be helpful. "No, it's fine, just make me a flask of coffee," George replied, already heading toward the bathroom. I went downstairs and made the coffee. I also managed to butter a couple of rolls and drop some cold meat into them. When George came down, I handed him the flask and the food. "Here," I said, watching as he grabbed them without much of a word and left the house. I sighed, feeling the weight of the situation as I headed back upstairs to freshen up before checking on Melissa. By dinner time, George still hadn't returned. I had looked down the farm road several times, hoping to spot his Jeep coming down the track, but there was no sign of him. I fed Melissa and put her to bed for the night, leaving the door slightly ajar to listen for any noise in case she woke up. I went to my room, lying on top of my bed as I pored through a few more chapters of my book. It was nearing 10 p.m. when I heard a car pull up outside. The unmistakable sound of George, slightly less drunk than the night before but still not sober, filled the air. I heard him mumble something to the driver before the car pulled away. I met him at the door as he staggered inside. "You need to stop this," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. As I approached, I noticed the lipstick marks on his collar and the smell of perfume clinging to him. "Where have you been?" I asked, my voice now edged with frustration. Just went for a couple," George muttered. "More than a couple," I countered, crossing my arms. "This has to stop, George. You've got Melissa to think about." He slumped into a chair, his head in his hands. I could hear a faint sob escape his throat. "I miss Grace so much," he mumbled, the tears starting to come. I crouched beside him, placing a hand on his arm. "I know it's hard, but you have a wonderful daughter, George, and she needs you. She wants her dad with her. Sober. Not like this." He sniffed, wiping his eyes. "I know," he whispered. "But it's so hard." "I know," I replied softly, squeezing his arm gently. "You want anything to eat?" He shook his head. "No." I'll just get some sleep. We've got a big day tomorrow, he said, rising unsteadily to his feet. I watched him head upstairs before locking the door and turning off the lights. I stood there for a moment, the heaviness of the situation sinking in. This wasn't going to be easy, not for any of us. The next week showed some improvement. I busied myself with Melissa during the day, and George only had a few minor slip-ups. He disappeared on Tuesday night and again on Wednesday, returning drunk each time, though not as badly as before. We had spent a few hours each evening chatting about Melissa, Grace, and his feelings. I felt like we were making progress, albeit slow. On Thursday, I decided to take Melissa into the village. I asked George if she had a buggy.
Yeah.
It's up in the loft, he replied, grimacing as he recovered from the previous night's hangover. Once he left for the fields, I went to check on Melissa, then headed to the loft to retrieve the buggy. It wasn't much of a loft, more like a small room built at the back of the house. Inside, I flicked on the light and looked around. Crates and boxes were scattered everywhere. I found the buggy soon enough, but being the curious type, I couldn't resist opening a few boxes. Please subscribe my channel for the next part. And visit my Patreon page for early access.